All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a look at a game from round number 10 of the Tata Steel Masters Chess Tournament played in Vacanze in the Netherlands. Now, for today's game, we're going to take a look at the game played between two Indian players. We're going to take a look at the game between Vidit Gujrathi, who is having a very good tournament, and Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa, also from India, the young junior player, who is unfortunately not having a great tournament thus far. All right, so the game starts with d4 here, knight f6, c4. Now we have e6 played here, knight c3, bishop b4, queen to c2, castles, and now we have a3 played by Vidit, bishop c3, queen takes c3. All this is very standard thus far, which is why I'm not giving any explanation. We have d5 played here, bishop g5, and now Praggnanandhaa chooses to play c5 here, which is one of a couple options. Now, it's worth noting that he did play it before, so it's not a surprise. Now, my belief is that generally speaking in this position, both d takes c4 and h6 are considered a little bit more solid here. But Praggnanandhaa lost the game to Rapport earlier in the tournament, so obviously he wanted to prove that he was in it to win it. He's not going to stand down. He's going to be stubborn and stick to his line. Now, you guys are asking, what is this variation? This is the Nimzo Indian Classical with queen to c2 played on move number 4. So now we have d takes c5 being played, we have pawn to d4, and now we get queen f3. Now, it's worth noting that in the previous game against Richard, queen to g3 was played here and not queen to f3. So we have queen f3, knight bd7, and now we have e3 played here. We have pawn to h6, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6. Now, again, all pretty standard, nothing too crazy to see thus far. Very normal developing moves. Once again, white has issues on the king side. You're not developing the bishop, the knight, or the rook very, very quickly. So he chooses to play e3, tries to open up the diagonal for the light square bishop. So now we have pawn to h6 being played here. So pawn to h6 is played, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, and now castles is played here by Vidit. So castles, pawn to e5, and now we have knight to e2 being played. Now, it's worth noting that in this position, it looks like white is up a pawn and doing very, very well here. However, black has a lot of ideas to attack. You have ideas like bishop g4, queen to a5, and a lot of quick development, especially towards his king on c1, since, again, white is lacking in development. Knight e2 is played. Now we have d3. Again, black cannot capture the pawn on e3 because then you would lose your queen on d8. So we have d3 being played here. Knight to c3, and now bishop g4, and it looks like, oops, white has made a big blunder because, again, white is going to be losing material. If you play queen takes b7, black can just take the rook, and after knight d1, e4, this bishop on f1 and this rook on h1 are very, very sad because these pawns on e4 and d3 prevent the development, much like in the game between Richard Rapport and Praggnanandhaa early in the tournament. So Vidit plays rook takes d3 here, and now we have queen a5. Now, again, another option would be to play bishop takes f3, but after rook takes d8, rook f takes d8, g takes f3, black can play this move. I think rook to c8 is one option, or even potentially a5 here. Both moves are playable, and it appears that black has enough counterplay. But again, white should be relatively fine due to the two pawns and the bishop for the rook on a8. So as we go back, queen to a5 is played here. Now we have queen to g3. Queen takes c5 is played, and now rook to d2 played by Vidit. Now, again, when you take a first cursory glance at this position, you'll notice that at the moment, white is up a pawn here. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So white is up a pawn, but again, you're lacking in development. And your king is also maybe a little bit loose here. Black can play rook c8, maybe rook d8. Also bishop e6, which puts pressure on the pawn on c4. So now we have bishop e6, which is played. Someone in chat asked why rook d2. Now, the reason is that currently your pawn on c4 is under attack, and you can't really move the rook to any other squares on the d file. You go to d4, black takes. You go to d1, for example, I take your rook. So you can't really go anywhere. All of these squares are covered by various black pieces. So therefore, you want to guard this pawn on c4, but how do you guard it? The only way that you can logically guard the pawn is by moving the rook backwards and protecting it. b3 doesn't work either because then black just takes the pawn on a3. So rook d2, and now we have bishop to e6 attacking the pawn on c4, and now we have b4, queen to c7 is played, or sorry, not queen c7, queen to c8 is played. Now again, the reason for queen c8 and not queen c7 is that if you play queen to c7 here, white can go knight to b5. So you don't really want to allow this knight b5 trick because then your pawn on e5 is super weak. And also additionally, after queen c7, knight b5, say you go like queen b8, I can now jump with the pony to d6. I prevent the knight e4 fork, and also now I cut the diagonal so that you can't really guard the pawn on e5. Knight d6 would be quite dangerous. So after b4, queen to c8 is played, and now queen takes e5 is played by Vidit. We have bishop takes c4, king to b2. Now again, white keeps a slight advantage here. White is up one pawn still, and your king is relatively safe. However, as in the other variations, there are some issues because you have pushed these pawns in front of your king. And that's also why very oftentimes when white plays d4 on move 1, if you castle your king to the queen side, there always are issues because in many of the openings with d4, you push the pawn to c4, and in many cases you even push the pawn to a3. So when you get into these end games, or not end games, when you get into these late middle games, for example, like here, even though you're up a pawn, your king is always a little bit iffy. So in the d4 pawn openings, when you castle queen side, you have to be very, very careful. So king b2, and Pragg plays a5. Very logical move, trying to open up the queen side here. And now we get b5. Again, if you don't play b5, let's say you trade on c4, for example, there are options here like queen to d4 or even queen to f4 here. But I would say that after black goes queen to e6, when you play b5, rook a c8, feels like there's still some issues with your king. Again, computer says it's fine for white, but you do have to be very, very careful. Let's go back to this position. So b5 is played here. Now we have bishop takes f1, rook takes f1. White's idea, of course, develop the rook towards the center of the board, maybe even stack the rooks on d2 and d1. Queen to c4 is played here, and now you have rook c1 played by Vidit with the idea of potentially moving the knight off of c3 and attacking the queen on c4. You have ideas like knight to d5 potentially, knight to e2, maybe even knight a2, and again you'll notice that the rooks are on the two open files here. Now a4 played by Praggnanandhaa, and the idea behind a4 is quite simple. You want to play queen to b3 check, attack the king, and then capture the pawn on a3 here. So after a4, if you move the knight away, which occurs in the game with knight to b1 being played here, now black plays queen to b3 check, and you go king a1. Again, white retains the pawn advantage here, and you would think that white should be much better, and long term, if you can consolidate this position, white will be better, but you have a very passive knight, and your king on a1 is potentially a little bit weak here. Now we have rook a c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8 is played. Now queen to f5 played by Vidit, guards the knight on b1, and additionally you create checkmating threats. So let's say black plays a move like rook c1, looks really, really scary going for a checkmate towards the white king. Now you run into rook d8 check, cannot go king h7 because the queen covers the square, and after knight e8, rook takes e8. This is checkmate. So therefore, after queen to f5, we have queen to c4 being played by Vidit in this, or queen c4 being played by Praggnanandhaa here. And now you have rook d4 played by Vidit, puts the rook in the center of the board. It targets the pawn on a4. You still keep threats alive on the d file as well. So the rook is perfectly placed. Now we have queen to c7, attacking the pawn on h2 potentially long term. Now Vidit plays g3. Now it's worth noting that g3 is sort of the start of everything kind of collapsing for Vidit in this game. G3 really is the start of where he loses the thread and things start going the wrong direction. Why are we calling him Vidit? Because I think I pronounce it Vidit, and I believe that's incorrect. So Vidit is just his nickname that he goes by. I know Anisha's called him Vidit. So we're just trying to be respectful. Okay. So here we go. We have this position. In this position, what we have is rook d4, queen c7, and now we get g3. And the better try here would have been to try to be aggressive. Now, I suspect that during the game, Vidit did not realize just how weak his king could become here, because if he had, I think that he would have gone g4, followed by h4 and g5 to try and attack and open up the king side. So I do believe that this would have been a better try. And I think if he had realized the danger that was lurking long term in the position there, that he would have done this, because he would have been aggressive at least, and he would have had chances. And I also think that if he had played g4 and h4 and g5, I think Vidit would have won this game. So I think this was a step of really losing the thread. And one thing that's important in chess is you have to keep really good energy levels. You always have to be really focused, because when you start making like one or two moves that are not the best moves, it sort of starts to spiral and it affects the rest of the game. So we get g3 here, and now you have pawn to b6, rook takes a4 is played, and now we have knight to d7. And Pragg, to his credit, even though he's down 2 pawns, understands that the white king is very weak here on a1 because the knight on b1 is not great. If you get this knight to c5, it's an outpost. Pawn protects the knight. You can also play knight to b3 as well, and it's really, really dangerous long term. So we have rook to e4 being played. We have rook e4 g6, not knight c5 by the way, because after knight c5, white is a beautiful move, rook e7. And one thing in a lot of endgames is that when you're up by a couple of pawns or say a knight, there's some material advantage you have. If you can trade off pieces, then good things will happen. So in this position, if knight c5 is played and you get rook e7 in here, black cannot actually keep the rook and the queen guarded here. If you move the queen to say b8, I just take on f7, king to h8, queen takes g7, checkmate. And if black takes the rook on e7, queen takes c8, even though the king is still a little bit weak here on a1, the fact that white has 2 extra pawns here, the pawn at e3 and a3, should be enough to win the game. Although it's worth noting that in this position, the computer still only gives it as 0.3 when you look at the bar. I guess it just spiked to 0.5, but you see it only says 0.3 despite the 2 pawn advantage. And again, when you look at pure evaluations, normally if you're up 2 pawns, that should be plus 2.00. So you see that even here, there are some fundamental issues. So back to the game. In this position, g6 is played by Praggnanandhaa, and now we get queen to f4 played by Vidit. And now queen to c5. Of course, you don't trade. Obviously, if you trade the queens, after rook takes f4, in this position, white is simply up 2 pawns once again. So now we have queen c5 being played. Queen takes h6, and this is the big mistake of the game. The big mistake. So as you'll notice, the bar goes from about a small edge for white all the way to -3. And the reason is because king safety. King safety, king safety, king safety. I cannot stress it enough. So when Vidit takes the pawn on h6 here, after black captures on b5, the problem now is that black is always going to have a lot of threats towards this king. Knight c5, b3 is one idea. You have ideas like rook c1, queen f1, maybe even queen e2. And the king is under serious fire here. So in this position, what Vidit should have done was he should have played rook to b4. And let me just make a random move to highlight the point. Let's just say black plays a move like queen c1. You can now go queen to d4, and you'll notice the rook guards the knight, and after knight to c5, you can play a move like, I think, queen d2, and white's king is pretty safe here. Rook guards the knight, it covers e4 and b3, where the knight would like to jump, and long-term white should still have a very small advantage. So after queen c5, Vidit plays queen takes h6, and I'm hard-pressed to understand why he played this move. An explanation sort of eludes me here. What I will say is that I suspect that after queen takes b5, he figured he's still up 2 pawns, and he didn't realize just how dangerous this position is because he thought his king was safe. And probably additionally, he also thought that maybe he could create threats like h4, h5, or rook h4 and go for a quick checkmate. But neither of these ideas are really fast enough because if you play rook h4, I go queen e5 check, I cover the h8 square in the checkmate, go king a2, I have rook c2, king b3, queen to b2 check, king a4, and now there's knight c5, king is stuck on the rim, and that's checkmate. And if white plays rook to d4 here, preventing that idea, now you can go knight to c5, followed by either knight to b3 or knight e6. Again, the king on a1 is so weak here, and black should be winning. So therefore, we have a4 being played, and now queen to c6, attacking the rook and keeping an eye on the pawn at a4. Queen to f4 is played. Again, if you try rook h4, it's the same thing. You go queen f6 check, guard against the mate, and after rook d4, knight c5 again, same thing with knight b3. So queen f4 is played here, and now we have the move knight to c5 being played. So we have knight to c5 here, and now we have rook c4 played by Vidit. Again, very tricky, as you'll notice here. The problem is that the rook doesn't have many good squares. If you play rook e5, I have knight d3 with the fork of the rook and the queen. You go to d4, I have knight b3 with the fork of the king and the rook, or additionally knight to e6 with another fork here of f4 and d4. So you can't really go to d4, and if you go to b4, I have knight d3 as well, forking the queen and the rook. So you really don't have squares. All 3 of these squares get forked one way or the other. So because of that, you have to find a square to put the rook on where you don't just lose the game. And here Vidit puts the rook on c4. Now at first glance, you're like, wait a second. If you play rook to c4 here, black can play knight to b3 check, king b2, and take the rook. But after queen takes queen, rook takes queen, king takes knight, let's just say rook c1 to stay active. After white goes knight c3, followed by knight to d5 here, white is going to be okay because he's going to get an outside pass pawn, which will force black to go defensive, bringing the rook either behind the pawn or all the way back. and white should have enough to draw the game. Now, much to his credit, despite not having a great event so far, Pragg does not take the easy way out. He decides that, you know what, the white king should be a little bit weak. I'm not going to give Vidit a draw. I don't care if he's 2700. I want to beat him. Now he plays rook to d8. And the idea is quite simple. Black just wants to argue the king is super weak here. White has to really pay attention to the pawn at a4. Additionally, you can get active with like rook d1 and queen h1, and it should be very hard to play. So now we have rook to c2. Queen to h1 is played. Now we get queen to b4, played by Vidit. Idea is that you want to guard the knight. Additionally, if you can capture this pawn on b6, the knight on d5 becomes dislodged, where you have to move it out of the way. Say you move, I'm just going to make a random move like rook e8. After queen takes b6, the knight can no longer stay here, from whence it can go to b3 or d3. And so this is really critical that Praggnanandhaa here, low on time, finds a good move. And so in this position, he does find a good move. He plays his move, knight takes a4. And the reason this is such a strong move is that if white takes the knight, you have rook a8, and the queen guards the rook. Again, pretty classic right triangle, the gigantic 90 degrees. So this is a great move. But it's worth noting that after knight takes a4 is played, Vidit here, I think, if he had been playing someone like Magnus, for example, I think he would have taken a safer, more cautious approach instead of what he does in the game. And the reason I say that is because in the game, he plays this move rook to d2. Now, it's worth noting that black is better after queen takes a4, rook to a8, queen takes, and king b2. But again, with a pass pawn here on b6, it can, maybe it's not a pass pawn, but the pawn on b6, it can go to b5 and b4, and you can support either queen a3 or queen a4. Black is a little bit better, but I do suspect that with perfect play, white can set up a fortress here, and draw the game. So in this position, I think if Vidit had been playing a player who perhaps a little bit higher rated, maybe if they weren't having such a bad tournament, he would have taken the knight and tried to sort of grovel, be solid, and draw this game, and just go from there. However, as it turns out, Vidit decides that, you know what, either he doesn't sense the danger or he didn't want to suffer a little bit, and he chooses not to go for this option. Instead, he plays rook to d2. Now we have rook to c8 being played here by Praggnanandhaa, queen to e7, and now queen to a8. Now this is an absolutely perfect move. 40th move for Praggnanandhaa. He was really low on time here. I think he only had maybe 45 to 50 seconds. If he doesn't find queen a8, he actually has no chances of winning this game. In fact, he has very good chances of losing this game, because oddly enough, even though the king is kind of open, if we do the material count, you have 4 pawns versus 3. So white will be fine if you can exchange. So after queen to e7 is played here, we have queen to a8 played by Praggnanandhaa. Logical move, stop the rook d8 check, avoid the trades, additionally threaten knight c3 and check the king. And so white is forced to go rook to a2 here to prevent all of these discovered checks from the knight on a4. So after rook to a2 is played, we have pawn to b5 played by Praggnanandhaa. And now this is really, really bad for white, mainly because the pawn supports the knight, so the knight is stuck here forever. Additionally, the knight really prevents white from developing the king at any point, and now black can go hog wild with both the queen on a8 and the rook on c8 and try to attack towards the white king. And this knight is just glued to the square, so it always has jumps like knight to c3 or maybe even knight to b2. So someone asked in chat a very important question. They asked, why is rook to d7 not a good move? Now, the reason that rook to d7 is not a good move is that now black can play knight to c5 check, attacking the king. White has to block with the rook, and after black goes queen to f3 or queen to d5, I think both moves work. Their ideas like knight to b3, rook to c2 is a big threat, and this white king on a1 just has zero protection around it. So after queen a8, rook a2, b5 is played, we have queen to b4 played by Vidit, queen to h1, back again, trying to put pressure on this from the queen on h1 towards the king on a1. You have ideas like knight to c3 here as well, and this pin could be very deadly. Rook to a3 is played. Now we have queen takes h2, attacking the pawn on f2. Now we get queen to d2 being played here, and now we have queen h5. Very good move, by the way, by Praggnanandhaa. He decides to reroute the queen. Again, on h2, it's not doing a whole lot here. It's maybe attacking f2, but you want to use this queen. It is an active piece, the most powerful piece on the board in the game of chess. So queen to h5 is played here. Idea to reroute the queen, maybe e5 to attack the king. maybe h8, maybe even just to c5, maybe back to h1, maybe even to d1 later on. So the queen is very active, the rook is active, the knight is active. It's not like gonna move, but it's very active, and it also prevents this white knight from ever getting into the game with moves like knight c3. So now we have pawn to f4 played by VD, queen to f5. Again, logical move, maybe pressure like rook c1 at some point, maybe queen f6 as well, just keeping an eye on all the critical squares. Now we have queen to d3, queen to f6, queen to d4, and now we get queen e7. Centralize the queen, attack the pawn on e3, attack the rook on a3, and now you have ideas like rook d8 as well. Now someone in chat, to keep it a little bit interactive, asked why not queen takes b5. And so I think you're referring to this position after queen takes h2. Why not queen takes b5? Now the reason that you can't take the pawn on b5 is very nasty, and that is you have to look for right triangles in the game of chess. After white takes on b5, black has this very nasty move, queen to h8, checking the king on a1. Now you have no blocks, knight c3 I just take. You have no queen d4 because the queen's on b5. So if you go to e5, it's just a clean Botez gambit. You have to go king a2, and after king a2, I can now play this move rook to c2 check, king to b3, and now the very nasty idea, rook to b2 check, king takes a4, rook takes queen, king takes rook, and now queen b2 check, hitting the king and the knight. After the king moves, I just gobble the knight, queen versus rook, and this should be very cleanly winning for black. All right, so let's get back to the game. So after f4, queen f5 is played here, we have queen to d3, queen f6, queen to d4, and queen to e7. Now here, VD plays the move rook to b3, and now we get rook to a8. And after rook to a8, you'll notice that black again has threats like knight c5. Say you play a move like g4, I go knight c5 check, rook a3, and I have the very nasty move rook takes a3, knight takes a3, and knight to b3 check, forking the king and the queen and winning the game. So in this position after rook to a8, we have rook to a3, which is played, and now rook to d8 again. Good move, takes the rook off the b file from where it was attacking the pawn on b5, and now white has to play something like queen e5. Again, you're really running out of squares. The only square on the board is e5. Every other square is covered here. Queen cannot go anywhere. c3 and b2 are covered by the knight, b4 and c5 are covered by the queen, b6 covered by the knight, a7 covered by the queen. Only move. So after queen to e5 is played here, Praggnanandhaa makes a very, very good decision here, the most pragmatic decision that you could come up with, which is to trade the queens and play rook to e8. And now you'll notice that material is even temporarily, but black is going to win this pawn on e5, and additionally white is going to have these split pawns on e3 and g3. Sometimes they're very good. When they're very good, they're called the peepos. When they're very bad, we call them the lonely island pawns. Lonely island pawns. So rook e8, and now rook b3 is played. Rook takes e5, and again the pawns are split, and they are very weak in this position. So knight to a3 is played, and now Pragg plays knight c5. Brilliant move, understanding that in this position you're going to lose the pawn on b5, so you're going to try to find a way to win the pawns on e3 and g3 here. So now we have knight to c5 being played. Rook takes b5, and now rook takes e3. Now you'll notice that if white takes the knight on c5, after rook takes a3 check, king to b2, rook takes g3, black is simply winning with 2 extra pawns here on the king side. So after rook takes e3, knight c4 is played, and now we have rook to e1 check, not rook takes g3 of course, then white can simply take the knight on c5. So rook to e1 is played here, king to b2 is played, and now we have knight to e4, pawn to g4 being played, and now we have rook to e2 here. Now king to c1 being played by VD, and now we get knight to f2 here. Now it's worth noting again, white has this pawn on g4, which is potentially very weak. At the same time, there are a lot of ideas here, like knight to e5 to guard it, followed by like rook to b8 and rook to b7 here. So now we have knight to f2 being played. Now pawn to g5, king to g7, and while it looks like black can win this pawn very easily on g5, it's not so simple here, primarily because if you ever go like knight h3, for example, I can go, or sorry, actually after knight to 2, if I go like knight h3 and then I try to go rook g2, I'll just make some random moves. White can always go knight to e4 or knight to f3 to guard the pawn. So even though it looks like this pawn on g5 is super weak here, it's actually very hard to attack the pawn. So in this position, black sort of realizes that it's very difficult. If you play like f6, for example, ignore the bar shifts here. After pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn, for example, at some point white probably will be able to sacrifice this knight for the pawn. Say knight h3, rook a5 and g5. I can always sack, and this is a classic rook and knight versus rook, which is a draw with correct play here. All right. So in this position, if you ever try to trade the pawns, it's an easy draw. So what other endgames actually work in this? What other endgames can you achieve here where you have chances to win? So you can't really trade pawn for pawn. So then when you can't trade pawn for pawn, the only other endgame that you can really see where you can win is either you can get like knight h3 and say rook g2 and win the pawn and be up 2 pawns, or the one other option is try to trade the knights here. If you trade the rooks, by the way, just an example, this is actually a very easy draw because the knight guards the pawn, so you can never break, and with perfect play you won't win. So you can't trade the rooks. The only other endgame that makes sense is some endgame like knight e4, something like this where you can get an endgame with a rook and a pawn versus a rook, and this one is actually technically a draw in this specific position, but it's the one where you have chances to win because the white king is cut off by the rook on e4. So back to the game. So here we have rook to e8 being played. Vidit plays king to b2, rook to c8, logical move, cuts the king off by one row further away from coming into the game. Have rook d5 here, and this, by the way, is what I would say the final nail in the coffin, the final blunder by Vidit. Up to this point, I think that if he plays king b3 followed by knight to f3, I think there was a good chance that Vidit still draws this game. Instead, he plays this move rook to d5, trying to centralize the rook. He guards the knight, guards the pawn. Of course, it's a classic 90-degree right triangle, but this is one of the few times that the right triangle is a very big mistake. Now we have knight to d1 check, and now white has to be extremely careful in this position for a few reasons. First of all, go to a2 or you go to b1. Both of these squares, there's knight c3 with the clean fork, the king and the rook. You go to a1 here, black can go rook a8 check, only move is king b1 and the knight c3 with this fork. So already in this position, white is kind of limited in terms of moves. The only two moves that you can play are king a3 or b3 to avoid losing on the spot. The problem is that if you go to b3 here, for example, black can actually now go rook to b8 check, and now you have to be very careful. There are 4 moves where you get forked. If you go to a2, I fork. If you go to a4, I fork you. If you go to c4, I fork, and if you go to c2, I fork you one more time. So you actually have only one square here where you can go with the king and not lose the game, which is king to a3, but now you're cut off by even one row further. So after king to a3 here, this is actually a technical loss because now I can play knight c3, rook to d3, and now I can force the trade of the knights with knight b1 check. And if you go king a2, knight d2, rook b2, after rook b5, rook g2, f6, we trade. This is a completely lost rook and pawn endgame because your king is cut off completely, and I will escort the pawn up the board and win. Now we will of course show this later on because something similar to this will occur in the game, or should occur in the game, I should say. So king to a3 is played by Vidit, and now knight to e3 played by Praggnanandhaa. Great move here. If you go rook d4 to prevent the knight trade on c4, I fork you with knight c2. So you have to go rook d3, knight c4, and now after king b4 and trades, we reach a classic endgame, rook and 2 pawns versus rook and 1. Now in this position, it looks like because the white king is cut off so far here, this should be winning, but you have to be very careful. For example, you'd love to play f6 here, but after rook d7 check, you have to move the king, and then I just take the pawn on f6, and in this position, I am completely drawing without too much risk. So in this position, we get rook to c1 being played here, and now rook to a2, and Vidit decides that in this position, basically, you can't push the pawn because I'll check you. If you ever go behind the pawn, I'll play rook a5, and you'll notice that after rook to a5 here, you can't play f6, because if you play f6 here, again, I have rook a7 check, and it's a draw. And in this position, as we go back here after rook to a2, there really are no other ways to attack this pawn. So in this position, the only two ways that you can kind of play this are rook c7. This is one option, to where now you want to go f6, because say I play rook a1 f6, there's no rook a7 check, you covered that. And now again, after takes, we reach a winning rook and pawn versus rook endgame. The rook cuts the king. So here, Pragg plays king g8, low on time, trying to gain some time. Rook a8, king h7, rook a2, and now he goes king to g7. Now it's in this position that this is one of the last moments where Vidit has some chance to maybe create some tricks. And the only way to try and create tricks here is to play a move like rook to a3, and now after rook to g1, rook to a5. This is where it gets very, very concrete. Now the winning line here for black is to actually play this move pawn to f5. And the reason this is winning is because of how far away the king is, for starters. Now in this position you probably think, well, wait, but now white checks. You do not play en passant, because after pawn takes, king c3, I go rook d1, and now the king is cut off too far. And those of you guys who have not studied your rook and pawn endgames, I will show you guys how to win this position. This is known as the Lucena position. It was discovered in the mid 1600s, so it's been known for almost 500 years. So after rook a1, you go g5. I'll play rook a8. You go g4. Check, king g5. Check, king f4. Rook f8. King g3. Rook g8. Now I just do the ziggy-zaggy. Rook g8. Push the pawn. Move the king. Push the pawn. And now when white plays this move, king to c1, you build a bridge. And how you build a bridge is you play this move rook to d4. After king c2, you go king f2 here, threaten to queen the pawn. White checks. King g3, threaten to queen the pawn. Rook g8, and now you build a bridge. You play rook g4, and white can trade, and then you make a queen. If white chooses not to trade and moves the rook away, now you just make a queen. Those of you guys who want to see a more detailed video on how to win the Lucena position, we do have a video on our channel of when I gave a lesson to Bjergsen, the former TSM League of Legends star, currently with Team Liquid. So make sure to check that out if you want to see a more detailed explanation of how to win rook and pawn versus rook. All right, so back to the game. We reached this position, and now here Vidit plays rook to a5, and this is actually really the beginning of the end, because what happens is now after king f8, you basically have to play rook to e5. Now this is the only move where you can play it and try to survive, because now after black plays f6 here, you go rook e6. Black has to find rook f1, only move, and after g takes f6, king f7, rook a6 here, you have to find the very critical move rook to c1 to cut the king off before you march the pawn up the board and win this technical endgame. Now again, easier said than done. Obviously at this point both players were low on time, not sure what to do, but in this position Vidit chooses to play this move rook to a7 instead, and now Pragg without fail plays every move perfectly. First of all, he plays king to e8, idea to bring the king up, and now this is what we call zugzwang. So ideally white would like for it to be black's move, where the rook cuts off the king, no squares. If black plays rook g1, then you come back, but you want it to be black's turn. Unfortunately, it's white's move here. So in this position, if you play a move like king to b3, for example, now I can go rook to c5. I cover rook a5, and I just gobble on g5. You go king b5, I can go rook g1, gobble on g5 again. So you can't really move the king anywhere, so king is stuck. Now you don't really want to move the rook, so when you move the rook, my king comes up. But again, it's zugzwang, and unfortunately it's zugzwang for white. So now we get rook a5, king d7. Again, you have to move the rook away. Rook a6, and now another zugzwang with king e7, because now again, if you ever move the king, I still have rook c5. And again, you'd love to keep the king cut off, but you can't keep the rook on the file. If you go rook b6, there are a couple ways to win, but easiest is just rook b1, trade the rooks, king e6, king f5, and gobble, and you win the king and pawn endgame. So you can't really keep the rook on the 6th rank. You can't move the king, so again, you're kind of stuck. So now we get rook a2 being played, and now king e6, obviously just trying to bring the king closer, and now rook a5, and here Praggnanandhaa plays one of the last moves that's important. He plays this move rook to f1. Worth noting, there are many ways to win here. f5 is winning, for example. You can also go rook g1, rook e1. Rook f1 and rook e1 are probably the two moves that I would probably recommend here in this position. Whoops, sorry. It's probably what I would recommend in this position, because they both have the same idea. If you play rook e1, you can go rook to e5, try to hit the pawn, and after rook f1, it's the same thing, where you have rook f5 attacking the pawn on g5. So he plays rook f1 here, and now we get rook a6, and now the last critical moment here, which is that Praggnanandhaa does not throw away all the hard work and effort and go king f5. It's a logical move attacking the pawn. If you go king f5, there's rook to f6 check, and now you actually lose the rook, and you lose the game. So to his credit, Pragg does not get tired and fall asleep at the wheel. He plays king to e5 here, and now after rook to a5 check, he goes king f4. As you'll note, the rook also guards the pawn, so if you play rook a7, I just take and guard the pawn. And after king f4, we get king to c3, and now Praggnanandhaa plays king g4. Rook guards the pawn, and it's just simply over because you have rook f5. Offer the trade of the rooks, or you win the pawn. So say king d4, rook f5 here. If you move the rook back, I just take. If you trade, I just take, and it's all over. So in this position, after king g4, VD resigns, a very crushing defeat for him. With this loss, he sort of falls out of the running or the contention for first place, and now he's to settle on playing for, say, third or fourth place and just trying to gain some ranking points. So very, very crushing loss. Very, very good win for Praggnanandhaa as well. And it's looking up. So Praggnanandhaa wins today. Niels Grandilis, another player struggling throughout the tournament, wins his first game. So it's sort of a very nice day for the players at the bottom of the table. They have something to be inspired about as we go into the rest day. So before we keep moving on, I will just preview a little bit about the pairings coming up. So in the next set of rounds, it's going to be very interesting. Again, Magnus retains his lead. He's still leading the event at this point. He has 7 points out of 10. He will be playing in round number 11 with the white pieces against none other than Vidit Gujrathi, who, after this very brutal loss with the white pieces, now is to play with black against Magnus. Going to look very, very nasty. Very, very, very tough pairing in round 11. We also have Dudov versus Shanklin. Jordan Van Forest versus Anish Giri, who is a half point out of first place. That also looks to be a big game. Jordan lost a very tough game today to Andrei Yesipenko, so he's also struggling a little bit. So Anish probably will look to go for blood. He'll try to play something aggressive, I assume, and try to put some pressure on Jordan. Again, anything can happen. We have Niels on 3 points playing against Andrei Yesipenko. Richard Rapport on 6 points playing against Neil Dubov, who lost to Niels today. Then we have GM Praggnanandhaa on 3.5 playing against Fabiano Caruana. So it's going to be a very exciting round 11. Really looking forward to it. And of course, we'll see what happens, you guys. All right.